I'm Mary Gallagher. I'm the director of the Lieberthal-Rogel Center for Chinese Studies, and I'm happy to introduce the speaker today for the Weiser Center for Emerging Democracies, Anna Grzymala-Busse, who is also our former colleague at the University of Michigan. She's the Michelle and Kevin Douglas Professor of International Studies in the Department of Political Science at Stanford University, and her research interests include political parties, state development, and transformation, informal political institutions, religion and politics, and post-communist politics. She's the author of a recent book, Redeeming the Communist Past, Rebuilding Leviathan, and her most recent book, The Nations Under God. Please join me in welcoming her. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's lovely to be here. It's lovely to be back on a beautiful, crisp Michigan fall day. So thank you for coming and spending some of that beautiful, crisp Michigan fall day listening to some pretty depressing news about populism. So in my talk today, I'll be presenting some findings from a project I'm directing in Stanford on global populisms. And what I'll try to do is basically make 3 points. I'd like to define what populism is, because that word has been bandied about a lot, and a lot of, there's still a lot of confusion about what exactly populism means. I'll talk about why it is on the rise in Europe, and why it's even now governing in several countries. And I'll talk about the ways in which it's eroded democracy in places where the populists control government in Europe. So first, what is populism? Well, all populist parties and movements basically make 2 claims, and this is what distinguishes them from others. The first claim is that the elites are a corrupt and self-serving cartel. So business elites, political elites, whether it's politicians or businessmen or journalists, are all in this cartel that's entirely self-serving, and they're in it for themselves. This is the swamp, right? And the second claim is that given this kind of cartel, the people have to be represented, and they have to be better represented as the people. There's basically a claim here to the general will. So rather than representing class interests or regions or ethnic groups like many other parties do, populist parties claim to represent the people or the nation. Now, this has 2 kinds of implications. The first of these implications is that liberal democratic institutions are not to be trusted, because they're basically the creatures of this corrupt, illicit cartel. And as a result, what populist parties often call for is much more direct representation and sort of politicization of the state to serve popular interests. The second implication of this definition is that the people have to be defined. And in Europe, at least, the people are usually defined in fairly exclusivist terms. So marginal groups such as immigrants, ethnic minorities, religious minorities are all excluded from this definition of the people. And then once these parties become more empowered, they basically define the people as those who are loyal to the party. Those who criticize it are basically traitors. They're not the real people. Now, worryingly, in Europe, where I focus, we've had a steady growth in support for populist parties. And if you look at the green line, those are sort of the old member countries of the European Union, so the established Western democracies like Germany, Italy, Netherlands, France. We basically see a tripling of support from the 1970s to today. It's actually gone up. This is data through 2016. It's actually gone up even higher since then. So basically, there's a tripling of support in Western Europe of support for these populist parties. In the new member countries, the post-communist democracies, Poland, Hungary, Czech Republic, Slovenia, and so on, you start off higher at around 15% in the first free elections after communism ends, and support more than doubles by 2016. And since then, unfortunately, it has also gone up as well. So the general pattern is that we see the steady rise in populist support across Europe. And what's worrying is that in post-communist countries, we see the greatest populist surge in the very poster children of economic and democratic reform, in Poland and in Hungary, where these countries are the most successful in implementing both free market and democratic reforms, and yet now they have populists in power. And these populists, once they enter government, basically, as we'll see, follow several worrisome policies. So we had this bizarre situation in which sort of the early scruffy revolutionaries of 1989 that so charmed observers, right? This is, Viktor Orban. Viktor Orban, 40 pounds later, is here. And this populist party, Fidesz, starts off as the party of young Democrats. It's a party of committed liberals in the European sense. So they both want a free market and incredibly sort of cosmopolitan cultural policies. They start off as a party of young Democrats. The rule was that you couldn't be a member if you were over 30, but as the leaders turned 30, that got blurred a little bit. And this party basically makes this conservative nationalist move in the 1990s. and becomes a sort of a right-wing populist party, and then basically starts to take off electorally. It makes steady gains in the 2000s and gains 2/3 of the seats in 2010, retaining that margin basically since then, the elections of 2014 and 2018. In Poland, you have peace, law, and justice. The rule here is if any party features the words law or justice in its name, it stands for neither. This is Jarosław Kaczyński, its leader. The crown is entirely coincidental. And this is a party that's conservative and populist from the start. So from the beginning, it basically articulates this claim that the various changes after 1989 in Poland were illegitimate, and they were the fruits of this sort of collaboration between communists and some of the opposition forces, and they're here to sort of clean house. And this party in 2015 wins over 1/3 of the vote and well over half the seats. Now the question is, what accounts for this rise of populism, both across Western Europe and in these countries in particular? And so I will argue that there are basically 4 different causes of varying degrees of importance. The first one of this is economic change and the recent crisis. There's also immigration and the pressures that it's imposed on these polities. There's international influence. And above all, there's the failure of mainstream parties, both to respond to the electorate and to contain the populist threat. So first, there's the economy. And this is sort of the classic image, where the austerity policies that followed 2008 and 2011 are seen as being responsible for feeding populist resentment and grievance. But it's not clear that there's a direct connection between economic performance and populist support. Because in Poland, for example, the GDP has grown every year since 1989, and Poland didn't suffer at all during the economic crisis, and yet it still succumbed to populism. You see basically populist, and you see countries that did suffer a lot, like Spain, that didn't see a surge in populist support. So there isn't a direct linkage, even though clearly this may be a source of electoral resentment. Secondly, there's immigration. And here, immigration and the recent wave of immigration has posed a double threat in Europe. On the one hand, it's seen as a source of labor and, more importantly, welfare competition. So the worry is that these new refugees and immigrants, as they come in, basically take up resources from the welfare state, which is already highly strained. So they'll strain the healthcare system, the educational system, and so on. And those are already stretched pretty thin. And there's this cultural threat as well. There's a perception that these are relatively homogeneous and relatively liberal cultures. And now they will have this influx of immigrants who are both very different from the native population and who make all kinds of conservative cultural demands on it. And as a result, what we think of as a moral imperative to take in refugees, or what some people think as a moral imperative to take in refugees, the 1.5 million people who arrived on the shores of Europe in 2015, often in rickety boats with families, entire families coming from Syria and other countries, is seen by others in Europe as basically an onslaught, right? A giant wave of brown faces that's now going to overtake a very blonde Europe. And for this reason, there's definitely a relationship between sort of the levels of populist support and the immigrant population, the average immigrant population in these countries. There is some relationship here, although again, it's not as straightforward as we might think. Because again, Poland, for example, accepted no refugees at all during the recent crisis, and yet managed to retain enormous populist support. So third, we have the international aspects of populism, exemplified, but not limited to, Vladimir Putin. And Putin is very much anti-democratic. He wants to sort of destabilize the European Union. He wants to destabilize the Western alliance between the United States and Europe. And above all, he wants to basically destabilize the situation politically so that he has greater room to maneuver. And so accordingly, what we see Russia doing is engage in several tactics of basically electoral manipulation and attempts to sort of swivel support to the populace. There's over-propaganda about voter fraud, fake news. Russia Today and Sputnik were broadcasting constantly. Various internet and Twitter bots that were basically fully sort of mobilized to this effort. There's party financing. Marine Le Pen, for example, in the last elections received €9 million for her electoral campaign, which may not seem like very much to us, given the sort of billions that are being thrown around in the electoral campaigns, but in that much, much smaller and more controlled electoral market, this was a huge sum. There are cooperation agreements with populist parties, such as the Freedom Party in Austria or the Lega in Italy. And there's also covert interference. There's denial of service attacks. There was an attempt at a coup in Montenegro because it was seen as favoring the West too much, and so on. What we also see is other coordination among populist parties themselves. You see all kinds of bilateral agreements and meetings. Hungary and Poland, for example, sees its populists literally meeting for hours at a time to coordinate strategy and to sort of coordinate their common defense. And both parties then announced that in the European Parliament, should either country be criticized, the other one rise to the other's aid. And so there are a lot of meetings. There's sort of an articulation of a shared vision of mutual support. And in the Polish and Hungarian case, this is all done in the name of a defense of Europe against the madness of the left and Islamism, right? So this is both sort of a sign that these parties are collaborating. They're sort of openly announcing this cooperation and sort of announcing what their vision is as well. Now, as if all of this weren't enough, the fourth factor, and the one I think in many ways matters the most, because it matters the most directly in these countries, is the failure of mainstream political parties to basically to contain this threat. Now, by mainstream political parties, I mean the centrist parties of governance, the social democrats and the Christian democrats that governed Sweden, France, Germany, the Netherlands, and so on for most of the 20th century. And where these mainstream parties are weak, populists prosper. It's almost a zero-sum game, right? Where they fail to articulate a clear vision, populists do better. And the basic problem here is that these mainstream parties have increasingly failed to absorb and to respond to all these popular fears about the economy, about immigration, about what's going on in the world and how rapidly it's changing. And instead, what they followed is basically a mainstream policy consensus. And this consensus, basically after World War II, took the form of a firm support for liberal democratic institutions, which meant that the process, rather than the outcome, was what mattered, right? That courts would adjudicate laws impartially. And so whether that favored someone or not should not have mattered as much as the impartial adjudication of that dispute. Secondly, they pursued increasingly free market solutions. And here, starting in the late 1980s and certainly by the 1990s, we see a lot of convergence between left and right parties. So for example, this is the time of the third way, when Blair basically announces that the Labour Party will now move much more towards the right when it comes to embracing free market solutions, privatization, a greater security state, and so on. The same thing happens in Germany, with Schroeder making the same move with the sort of the Neue Mitte, right, the new middle for the German Social Democrats. Immigration among these parties is seen as problematic. Some parties are willing to sort of accept that it's problematic, but it's also seen as necessary, and it's never really debated. And this is sort of the situation in the United States as well, where you have either sort of a consensus or some very polarized responses, but no real debate about the trade-offs, the costs and benefits of immigration in these countries. And that certainly was the case in Europe, where there wasn't a real considered debate about what the costs and benefits of immigration might be. Instead, it was seen as sort of something that we just have to deal with and cope with, and that's it. And finally, there was the European Union, which was both the means of this consensus. It became sort of seen as the entity by which domestic elites were handing over national sovereignty and handing over decision-making to a bunch of faceless Brussels bureaucrats. And at the same time, it was also the goal of this consensus. So in the post-communist countries, in the run-up to accession in 2004, all the mainstream elites, all the political parties lined up in consensus about the need to join the European Union. There was no one who criticized it among the mainstream. It was basically sort of a uniform distribution of views. Now, given this mainstream agreement on these liberal desiderata, and we may argue whether those are what we would want or not, what these parties stood accused of was basically complacency and a lack of responsiveness. They were also seen as indifferentiable, right? They were indistinguishable. It was hard to tell what these parties were offering because they all seemed to talk about the same stuff. And the one set of critics that emerged were these illiberal populists. These were the guys who would say things that nobody else would say. That immigration was in fact costly and wasn't so great. That in fact we stand to lose our cultural identity. That maybe we should talk about austerity in Brussels and all this other stuff. And so these became basically the one set of critics who broke this consensus and would say both their content and the style of how they would say it was basically unprecedented in European politics. And the populist critique of this consensus basically very nicely folded into their sort of broader ideological vision. So they view this liberal consensus as prima facie evidence of the elite cartel, right? These elites agree on everything. And why do they agree on everything? Because that serves, because they're a cartel, and it's entirely self-serving, and this basically just serves their own interests. And as a result, they also viewed all the institutions that these liberal elites had protected, whether independent courts or independent media or the European Union, as basically corrupt and tainted by by dint of who authored them. They view them basically as undermining both sovereignty when it came to the EU and national identity when it came to a whole slew of policies domestically. And so as a result, these parties argued, we need a new politics, a politics that actually reflects the popular will, by which, of course, they meant their own partisan interests, right? And what that meant in practice, unfortunately, is both the erosion of democracy and the politicization of the state. So if this is sort of how they arose, what happens once they're in power? And here I'll talk about Poland and Hungary as the two examples where these parties basically were in power. So once in office, I would argue, we need to take these parties both seriously and literally, because they basically have sort of three characteristics. One, they erode formal institutions of democracy. Two, they undermine the informal values that underpin democracy, which, as we've been finding out in the United States, matter every bit as much. And third, they tend to persist. They basically change the political discourse to such a degree that they are sort of self-reinforcing. And I'll use the example of Poland and Hungary, because here are two countries where these parties now govern without basically coalition partners. In 2010, Fidesz gains the constitutional supermajority, the 2/3 of the seats. In 2015, PiS gains the majority of the seats. And in both of those cases, that means they're going to be governing unconstrained by any coalition partner or, frankly, any other checks and balances. So they have enormous discretion to put their vision into practice. And it's discretion that they immediately use. And so what we see in both Poland and in Hungary is a very similar template. And it's sequenced in exactly this way. So the first target are the courts. In both Poland and in Hungary, courts become the first target of these populist governments. They're the first the first goal of these parties. And what they do basically is to politicize the courts and reduce judicial autonomy, because that could be a major constraint on these parties. And so courts are packed, there are age limits, judges are reappointed according to sort of a partisan template. In Hungary, my favorite example is that there was one person who was put in charge of all the judicial appointments in Hungary. And that person just happened to be the wife of the second in command of the governing party. So you can imagine the kind of discretion that this gives the governing parties. The second step is to attack the media. And because in these countries there's a large state-owned media sector, most of TV, for example, is owned by the state. What this basically means is a transformation of those public channels of TV into a state propaganda mouthpiece. Where basically, if you now look at the news in Poland or in Hungary on these channels, it's nothing but propaganda. It's it's as if Fox News were owned by well, maybe it is owned by the Republican Party, I'm not sure, but it's as if it were owned by a state, which clearly is not the case in the United States. And that basically means that because the internet saturation still isn't very high, especially in the rural areas, that's the main source of information that most people receive. The third target are civil society organizations, where there are new registration requirements. If you received any foreign funding, then you suddenly have to re-register under a much more stringent set of rules. In Hungary, the churches were attacked, as well as the universities. Central European University basically is hanging by a thread. It's the main independent university in Hungary, and it's become a favorite target of Viktor Orban. And finally, the legal framework gets changed. And this is especially the case in Hungary, where what you have basically is that constitutional supermajority being used almost immediately. So the party gets re-elected back into office in the spring of 2010. By January of 2011, there's a new constitution in place. And that constitution basically changes things so that the party is guaranteed a further incumbency, including changes in the electoral laws, which basically greatly favor the governing party. In Poland, you have similar attempts to change the electoral laws, but what we don't see is this full-fledged constitutional effort because there simply aren't the numbers. Secondly, we have the erosion of informal norms of democracy. The opposition is marginalized. Kaczynski, for example, in Poland refers to those who don't support the party as a worse sort of Poles, right? They're vermin. They're not, part of the body politic. Any kind of efforts by, previously in these parliamentary systems, there was opposition representation in various committees. These are now basically done away with, and instead all of these committees now much more heavily favor the governing parties. Media access is excluded, so there are fewer press conferences, and they only are given to favorable media. There's no informal accountability, publishing donor names to the parties or the kind of contracts that the party sets up and sponsors are now basically no longer accessible. And instead what we see is the funding of all kinds of friendly local organizations, of astroturfing. right? Of basically funding organizations that look like independent civil society, but in fact are funded by these political parties. We also see a lot of rewarding of allies. So even though these parties come to power on the strength of this anti-elite cartel message, they're more than happy to reward their allies with favorable government contracts and so on. And finally, as a result of that, we also see conflict of interest norms being almost entirely abandoned in the region. In Poland and Hungary, we also see ones of particular form that this takes, which is the politics of memory and identity, where there's an entire rejection of the communist past and the kind of communist party successors and politicians that emerge from that past. It's seen as basically entirely tainted. And instead, these parties sort of pursue a division of society into good and bad. This, for example, is the House of Terror in Budapest, which is a museum devoted to equating the years of communism with the years of fascism, right? So communism and fascism are the same thing, even though in Hungary, at least, by the sort of late 50s, this becomes the happiest barracks in the communist camp. Communism is actually a very relaxed regime compared to some of the other countries. But nonetheless, this is an attempt to once again sort of get rid of a whole sort of potential set of people who might have a counterclaim to governance, who might be the opposition, who might found parties, that they're basically no longer legitimate. Now, what's worrying about all of this, finally, is that this persists. Because what basically happens is that the range of the acceptable rhetoric, the so-called Overton window, now shifts. So rhetoric and language that was seen as unacceptable only 2 or 3 years ago is now seen as commonplace. And this is, I think, a pattern that we're also familiar here in the United States, where language that we would cringe at a few years ago is now uttered so frequently that we no longer even notice it. And that's one of the ways in which populism, again, erodes these informal norms of democracy, because it shifts how we think and how we talk about politics. Worryingly, in both, especially in Hungary, there's a whole new generation that's been socialized into populist politics. If you only voted for the first time in this year's elections, that means that you've spent your entire sort of older childhood, your entire sort of political coming of age under Fidesz, right? The party has been in power for over 8 years now. And so that also changes how people think of politics and the standards they use. And all of this, basically, has been done in the name of the people, as a change, and justified and articulated as a change from this previous corrupt status quo. And it's basically happened without much protest or alternatives from the mainstream, right? So there's basically, the mainstream parties are not very happy about this. They'll say that this is inappropriate, this is, eroding democracy. But they offer no real alternatives to the populist message, which of course only amplifies what the populists are saying all along, right? About these old, corrupt, unresponsive elites. Now, in case I've totally depressed you on this beautiful Friday afternoon, it's not all bad news. And that's because support for democracy remains very high.
I see the font is getting bigger here.
That's why I'm trying to, happy, good news. And it gets better because look, it's rainbows of happiness. I had to, I deliberately chose a very colorful scheme just so, we wouldn't be so depressed. If nothing else, I'm subconsciously trying to insinuate here some optimism. So if you look at this, this is support for democracy, and this is democracy defined as commitment to free and fair elections, to the to opposition, to the sort of peaceful alternation of parties in power. And if you look at this, it's over 75% in almost all of the countries that were surveyed last year, and that includes both Hungary and Poland, right? So we shouldn't think of support for populist parties as somehow a giving up on democracy, as a giving up on these noble goals. It's just fundamentally sort of a politics of sort of resentment and grievance with how that liberal democracy has taken place. Moreover, slightly less colorful, font is still big, voters tend to punish populist parties more heavily than they do other incumbents. So this is just a comparison basically of post-war rates of punishment of populist parties that get into parliament. And other parties tend to be punished less, relatively speaking, than populist parties do. There may also be other constraints. The European Union, so far, has been largely powerless. In fact, the European People's Party, because it relies on Fidesz, had been very protective and refused to criticize Fidesz. But this miracle happened, and Manfred Weber, their chair, is now running for the president of the European Commission and has suddenly rediscovered his democratic commitments and is now criticizing Hungary and is shocked to find that there's been democratic erosion going on in Hungary. So there may be more sort of movement from the European Union. The opposition parties, unfortunately, still remain both fragmented and, as I said, unable to articulate an alternative message. That haven't been able to coordinate, they're getting 10, 20% of the votes or of electoral support, and they simply aren't able to articulate an alternative message. But the one sort of ray of hope is civil society, and that's especially the case in Poland, where you have so huge marches. This is the Black March in response to the restrictions, increased restrictions on abortion in Poland, where people come out repeatedly into the streets to sort of attempt to constrain the government. And it seems to have worked in some cases, right? Certainly the abortion laws were kicked back. Some of the sort of more outrageous judicial reforms were also not implemented. And these protests continue, right? And the sign says there, populism destroys, right? So people know what the problem is, and there are plenty of them who are willing to come out into the street and at least sort of offer some kind of a suggestion that there's an alternative to this in Polish society. So to conclude, this populist surge that we see in Europe has its roots in mainstream political party competition and the very policies and consensus that helped to cement democracy earlier in Europe. It's kind of this bitter irony of the rise of populists. Voters continue to support democracy, but the populists they elect, unfortunately, do not. Thank you.
First of all, it's a great pleasure to have you back. That was extremely clarifying and discouraging. So, not to add more rain to your talk, but I wondered what it really means for the public to support democracy. That in the United States, at least, which is the place I'm familiar with, the standard story is that Americans support democracy in the abstract, but not in particular.
Mm-hmm.
So they line up behind democratic values when put in a very general way, and abandon them when their interests are challenged or they're threatened culturally. And so it seemed like a thin reed to me. So maybe you could tell me more about why that's an important finding.
Sure. So that's a very good point. And in fact, if you, for example, surveyed post-communist electorates, immediately after the fall of communism, what they meant by democracy was basically Sweden, right? So yes, you have multiple parties, but best of all, you have huge economic growth and a really healthy welfare state. So that question was actually very carefully posed. It was kind of a bundle of liberal democratic desiderata. So it was basically free and fair elections, the existence of the opposition, and peaceful alternation in power of parties, which on one hand is a pretty thin set of democratic commitments. On the other hand, it's the exact opposite of what the populists stand for. So it's, and I can't tell you if the support for plebiscitary democracy would be even higher, because I don't recall the data off the top of my head. But at least there's a commitment to liberal democratic processes, even if they don't favor the chosen candidates of those electorates. Yep.
I wonder if it isn't deeper than that. Ben Franklin, when he walked out of the Constitutional Convention, he was asked, did we get a monarchy or a republic? And he said, republic if you can keep it.
Mm.
And Earl Warren, who's probably, in my opinion, our greatest Chief Justice after he retired in 72, wrote a book called A Republic If You Keep It, which really could, the short title could be Democracy or Dictatorship, Autocracy, and of course there are royal families still some places. And his point, and Franklin's point, is that it depends on the people. You can blame the parties all you want, you can blame all these external circumstances, you can blame a failure to address this grievance or that grievance, but if the people don't support it and don't defend it, you're in a heck of a lot of trouble. And that's why I think a lot of people, you could have said what you're just describing there about the United States. I think your civil society notion, somebody has to get together, the people have to get together. I don't see why this is a technical issue between parties. It's like blaming the parties for being, letting Hitler in or Mussolini. I mean, what's the difference between that and what we're facing now in terms of the beginnings of it?
Well, I think it's kind of like blaming the passengers in a taxi for the taxi having an accident, right? You can tell the taxi where to go, but fundamentally it's the driver of the taxi that decides what speed and what direction. And I think the issue here is that when it comes to the erosion of both formal institutions and informal norms, it's political parties and specifically incumbents that bear the greatest burden. They're the ones who sort of, violate precedent. They're the ones who violate accountability and transparency. They're the ones who have a very public podium from which they can basically articulate these very sort of noxious and corrosive ideas. So clearly, yes, the people play an enormous role in a democracy, but it's, we should be appealing to the better angels of our elites to provide both the example and the behavior in office that protects democracy rather than hampers it.
Sounds kind of elitist way to think about it.
It's not elitist. That's why we elect these people, right? We elect them to protect democracy. That's the charge, because we can't do it ourselves.
Only 60% of the 50% of the people vote in the United States. I mean,
fair enough, but that's 60% once their voice to be heard.
So I have two questions. One question is about Steve Bannon, whom I'm fascinated with, and what he's doing. Like, what does transnational populism look like? Like, you mentioned the coordination between Hungary and Poland parties, and now we know that Bannon is also traveling around Europe with a lot of far-right parties. So what is their end game? Like, what is, because it's a nationalistic sort of more closed kind of theory of how national politics should function, what does it look like to have transnational populism? And then the other question I have is about the UK. So do you see Brexit, how do you see Brexit and the decision to leave the EU as part of this?
Mm-hmm. So on the formal question, I think this international populism largely has as its goal in all this coordination is basically political autarky, right? So rather than being influenced by the European Union, rather than by having to deal with global anything, you basically can, these parties can gain strength in their own domestic electoral arenas. And they're willing to support each other basically against the EU, against the alliance with the United States, and against any kind of transnational civil society or other understandings. So it's very much a political autarky which they think will benefit them. And so a Europe of nationalists is not one that can sustain a European Union. And that's, I think, one of the goals. When it comes to Brexit, I think it's clear now that the Brexit vote was manipulated in much the same way that the 2016 election was here in the United States. There's enormous effort by the Russians to manipulate it. And again, that has to be, I think, seen in light of Russian strategic considerations, which is if they can break up and destabilize the European Union, then suddenly they're the biggest game in town. So I think it's part and parcel of the same goal.
So when somebody like Fidesz and Viktor Orban's been in power for 8 years, how do they maintain the narrative that that's the swamp? Because aren't they now the status quo? How do they maintain the freshness of we are here to resolve the issue when you are the issue?
It's bread and circuses, right? And the bread part is really important. So what's happening in Poland is that one of the most popular things that that piece has done was to basically create a child subsidy. So every family gets about $125 per month per child, which may not sound a lot, but the average wage is around $2,000 a month, right? So that's a fairly sizable increase. And even in my own family, I have cousins who say, well, we can afford extra violin lessons, right? I mean, it's just a small little gesture, but to other families, this might mean sort of the difference between books or notebooks. In Hungary, by the same token, there's this sort of mass development of basically housing subsidies for young families who have to promise that they'll have kids, right? So it's sort of a natalist policy. But it also makes the exchange very contingent, because if they don't have kids, then the housing subsidy can be withdrawn at the discretion of the governing party. So I think it's both sort of fairly healthy distributionist policy on the one hand, and sort of the creation of clientelist networks on the other. That's going to basically keep them in power.
Thank you. Thanks so much for coming back. This is great. So I wanted to ask about on the definition of populism. Okay, so
we've argued about this before.
We have talked about this before. Let's talk about it publicly.
Let's arm wrestle for it.
Exactly. So two very clearly defining features, right, that you mentioned. So this anti-establishment sentiment, and then this kind of exclusivist view of the nation, and who the people are who then are against the establishment, right? But there's the third feature that it was maybe in your definition, but I'm wondering if it's part of the definition or if it's something that's more contextual and contingent. And that's sort of this idea, this dislike for liberal constraints. This idea that power should be exercised directly through the people rather than, and that anything that constrains the popular will is to be broken. Okay, and in the Asian cases I know about, I think of that as almost definitionally how it works. But it occurs to me from your talk that we can actually maybe try to figure this out by a little bit of sequence analysis, right? So what I'm curious about is if we look at at Fidesz and PiS, to what extent were they, before they sort of gained this sort of supermajoritarian power, were they already making a quote-unquote principled critique of courts, the Constitution, NGOs, any other kind of liberal constraints on power, because presumably before they have that supermajority power, it would be in their self-interest not to attack those. So I'm wondering, is that something that arises in the train of their own power, or is this actually something that defines who they are and the way they think about what democracy is, and that it should be a more inclusive, direct, and not mediated by and constrained by separation of powers and liberal limits on power?
No, it's entirely an ex post justification. It's not articulated in the electoral campaigns or in their earlier programs. And
Which is encouraging in a way.
That just makes it opportunist, right? It isn't.
Well, but if it, to the extent that they're weakened, right? That it's not, and this might help explain why we don't see the principled rejection of democracy among voters. And that, and again, if they lose that supermajority status, there'll be no longer this kind of that liberal constraints are the problem in general. It's just in the moment.
Right.
Potentially.
Okay.
So this is, of course, my question was also definitional, and so it's along the lines of, Dan, so if you define the people in this exclusivist way, and so by definition ethnic minorities and whatever are not part of the people, doesn't that almost automatically mean you're going to have to be against liberal constraints? So you can't simultaneously hold those two positions.
Sure. Well, that's right.
And so in some sense, I think Dan's partially right in that it's inherent in the definition of the people that you're opposed to liberal constraints and all this sort of stuff.
Right. I mean, to me, it's a clear logical implication. But then, of course, you have the example. I mean, and it's sufficient without being necessary. That kind of narrow definition of the people, because if you look at Latin America, right, it's a very different kind of populist, where it basically says, yes, we're against the elites, but we're going to redefine the people as including all the indigenous populations that until now have been marginalized. That's Morales from the start, right? That's Perón with his, the camisados. That's the Chavez. I mean, those are claims that those populists make, because the whole point is to again redefine the people, but in a much broader way. So I think the exclusiveness in Europe is sufficient without being necessary to the project of populism.
I'm thinking about the case of former East Germany. So how does communist nostalgia transforms into the higher voter turnout for the actual far-right party? This is the first one. Second one, yes, is also back to the definition of people. Is that more kind of transformation from a civic principle to an ethnic principle of the definition, or it can be mixed at the same time?
So to answer the second question, yes. It's a sort of shift towards a much more essentialist vision of what the people consist of. When it comes to East Germany, it's not so much about nostalgia for communism as it is a profound resentment of the way in which German unification proceeded. That, something like close to 30 years after unification, you still have differential standards of living, you still have differential infrastructure, despite all the billions of dollars poured into East Germany. Which is why East Germans, so the support for the AfD, which is sort of the extreme right version of this in Germany, is much higher in East Germany. And it's higher among older people and those who actually haven't had contact with refugees, right? Which suggests that this is politics of sort of resentment and fear much more than of sort of direct contact or of direct experience. Ella?
So I'm wondering if you have some insights on the divergence we do see. So there's maybe...
So the divergence
we do see in the success and the absorption of these parties. It could be coincidental, they just got that constitutional majority, but it feels like in some European countries they hit a glass ceiling. I know in Netherlands and in France to some extent. So I'm wondering if this is just a West-East story or if there's something more you feel is going on.
Yeah, I don't think it's just a West-East story. I mean, if you look at Austria, or if you look at Italy, for heaven's sake, right? I mean, the Italian elections were basically won overwhelmingly by two different populists. So I don't think it's East versus West. What I do think is the case is that in the more developed democracies, there's greater opportunity to basically erect a cordon sanitaire around the populace. So in France, right, you have Mélenchon, who himself is somewhat populist and is way out there on the left in French politics, telling his supporters that you have to support Macron in the second round of the presidential elections, anything to prevent Le Pen from winning, right? He's telling his voters to be strategic against his own sort of political interest. And if you do that, then you actually can contain the populace. And I think the potential to do that is considerably higher in West Europe than it is in these newer democracies of Eastern Europe.
Would you consider Poland a bit of an anomaly, given the strength of the church there and the institutional influence of the church? Kind of how you mentioned a lot of these parties try to delegitimize institutions, like Hungary did the church, but the role of the church in Poland has been historically very important and seems to be still. It's not like something
Sure.
go away.
In fact, I wrote a book about it.
Yeah.
So I think the Polish Catholic, the Roman Catholic Church in Poland remains very influential when it comes to policy, but it's not been particularly powerful here. it's in fact mildly criticized the peace government several times for basically overreaching and for sort of undermining the judiciary. But then, at the same time, there are sectors within the church who are highly financially dependent on the state and who are more than happy to articulate its message, articulate the message of the governing party. So the relationship is very ambivalent, and the church hasn't really done much one way or the other in this latest situation.
These are questions from upstairs.
The questions from upstairs. Okay. Okay, so this question asks that there's a possibility about the mainstream parties the reputation of the mainstream parties has been damaged to the point that they basically can't resurrect themselves and offer an electoral alternative. So I don't think that's the case. I mean, the beautiful thing about parties, and that's my first book, is that they can resurrect themselves, right? So even if you have a totally discredited political party, as the communists were after '89 in Eastern Europe, these parties can remake themselves and resurrect themselves. I mean, British Labour did the same thing in the 1990s under Tony Blair, when it jettisoned basically the unions, it jettisoned Article 4 of their program, and basically managed to win a whole bunch of voters that they thought they had lost. So I don't think that it's impossible. I think these parties can reinvent themselves, but I think the first step to doing that would be to differentiate themselves more and actually offer electoral alternatives that are credible in the eyes of the people. And the second question, how have populist parties been punished versus the mainstream parties? So for example, in the recent elections in the Netherlands, the Populist Party, despite heroic efforts and international help from Russia, did much less well than expected. In Latin America, you see examples of populist parties basically being kicked out of office time and time again. So it's not that, it's the pattern that basically seems to hold that as a percentage of their vote in the previous elections, populist parties tend to lose more, which is part of the reason, of course, why when they're in government, they want to entrench themselves so much, right, and basically become permanent incumbents. Yeah, Natalie?
So I'm wondering if you actually see what kind of electoral alternative should be suggested by the opposition parties to counteract that populist push, because maybe I understand that in Western stabilized democracies there is this institutional kind of more strategic thinking that helps to contain populism, but is there anything else, let's say, in what the winning parties suggest that help to counteract the populism?
Yeah, I think I'm not a campaign strategy expert, but the two obvious things to me would be to A, don't stoop to their language, don't sort of speak the same language, don't sort of go low when they go low. I think it's really important to model what politics ought to look like. The second thing is to actually look at who is your electorate and what do they need, right? And articulate, for example, in the United States, I think what I've been personally frustrated by is the Democratic Party's inability to at least convincingly articulate a message that basically goes as follows. We need more fairness. We need greater opportunity for everyone. All kids ought to have decent schooling, decent healthcare, and and decent air and water. And so, in order to do that, we need to do X, Y, and Z. And instead, the Democratic Party is perceived, rightly or wrongly, as basically either being about identity politics or being incoherent. And I don't think that's in a two-party system, that's not the way to get the plurality of the votes. So that's one sort of kind of option that I'm thinking about. But fundamentally, it means actually listening and identifying what you see as your core commitments and then articulating them rather than waving your hands about and protesting a lot, which is what these parties are doing right now. Yep.
How do these populist parties typically go about convincing the populace that they are the forgotten people?
How do the people convince the populace?
No, how do the populist parties typically go about convincing?
They didn't really have to convince them that much, right? They basically said, look what you've had all along, right? I mean, this is why Trump's phrase, "What have you got to lose?" resonated so much, because it's literally, look, these parties abandoned you. These parties don't look after your interests. They don't, do anything for you. They're busy, squabbling up there in Brussels and talking amongst themselves. And here we are. We listen to the people, and the implementation of these kind of distributive policies as one of their first acts makes it seem very credible, right? Finally, someone is listening to us. So they were exploiting sort of an existing resentment and set of grievances and just articulating it when nobody else has before. Yep.
Sort of on that note, I mean, we've talked a lot about Hungary and Poland where they kind of have the majority vote and are in the majority position, but countries like Italy and Austria, where they are now in coalitions, with exactly those parties that they have basically bashed upon in previous elections.
Right.
So how would you say their voters are seeing that, or that's being dealt with in their rhetoric and their being?
So that's actually one of the main reasons why populists lose power, because they're junior partners in coalitions that then basically undermine their anti-establishment claims. So it's very likely that, and the Freedom Party in Austria goes up and down, right? Sometimes it's in government, sometimes it's very tiny, sometimes, it's likely to lose votes if it can't convince its electorate that in fact it stood fast by its principles. And Sebastian Kurz, the leader of the People's Party, has been very good about sort of moderating the impact of that party, of the Freedom Party. So it depends. I think in Italy, the impact is going to be less because it's not as if there's much of a non-populist alternative, right? They're all sort of, for several years, basically since the collapse of the Christian Democrats, which you have basically is kind of a, attempt to figure out a solid set of policies that address the economic and political problems of Italy, and no one's actually figured it out yet. There's no clear and coherent alternative. Yeah?
Is the departure of UK from the European Union is part of this populism movement that's sort of getting shaped there?
It's certainly going to help it, right? It's going to certainly make it easier in two ways. One is that other countries can now say, look, this is possible. You can leave the European Union. And secondly, what Britain was very good at was supporting the new post-communist democracies in the European Union. It was its greatest, in fact, it was their greatest champion for entirely strategic reasons, but that's neither here nor there. But now the champion is gone, right? So you won't have this sort of powerful big brother saying, this is what a liberal democracy looks like. This is how I can protect your interests. You have to stay the course because if you do, these are the benefits you'll obtain. So I think Brexit is actually going to harm the EU quite a bit, not just because Britain is leaving, but because it also undermines the support for democracy in those post-communist countries. Don again.
Just a bit ago, you talked about the possibility of the reinvention or resuscitation of the mainstream parties. But it seems to me reinvention need not go in the direction of liberal democratic politics. So I'm thinking, forgive me, of the American case again. And you've got Trump right there in front of me, which is actually quite a good likeness, I think. It seems to me, maybe you don't agree with this, that what Trump has done partly is accelerate the transformation of the Republican Party from a mainstream party to a populist one. And I wondered whether you see that in the European case, whether there are mainstream parties that are taken over and moved in a populist direction.
Absolutely, that's Fidesz, right? Fidesz, which was the party of lovely young Democrats, then taken over. And then worse yet, Fidesz takes over other parties. So it took over the Christian Democrats, it took over the Agrarian Party, basically takes over other parties and co-opts them in this to articulate this new sort of even more powerful populist message. I mean, to me, Trump isn't just taking over the Democratic Party, he's making it into a personalist machine, right? It's the personalist aspect of Trump's takeover of the Republican Party that I find so curious. It's almost like the way he speaks about the party and the way he speaks about those who support him. It's language that's basically that's used by personalist leaders in Latin America in the 50s and 60s, and it's basically sort of deinstitutionalization of the Republican Party. So yeah, no, I'm terrified.
Well, we saw this in the Republican Party once before with the Southern strategies, immediately following the Democratic rule after post World War II, and the South began, quote, went solidly Democratic before then to basically Republican. And so all you're seeing with Trump is the next stage of that. We're going to get the disaffected people who were, quote, whites only.
Yeah, I think it was just an electoral realignment where so that who votes shifts for these parties. I think that's definitely part of the story. But I think to me what's more worrying is the fact that the character of the party is shifting as well.
Well, it did then too.
I think I'm not an expert in American politics, but the structures remain the same, right? And you still had the same kind of mainstream elites deciding sort of what the party stance would be. The Southern strategy was very much a cynical ploy that worked, but it wasn't the sense of changing the fundamental hierarchy and institutions of the Republican Party. It was much more sort of which set of voters do we now address? So that's I think what's worrying, and this is basically transforming how the party functions.
It's the token echo chamber fake news question for the day. So in an environment where information flows are much more controllable and tailorable, your proposal that parties, the mainstream parties, should hold on to civility. How can they maintain that stance? And is that electorally viable? And thinking through that, how do you potentially break the grip of something like Fidesz, who's controlling state media, who's controlling political socialization for upcoming generations? So yes, they should rebrand themselves, try and come back, but how might they achieve that comeback?
Right. So I think the first thing is to actually start coordinating. What you see basically, and this is, I think, to some extent the case in the United States as well, the opposition isn't coordinating its message. And that's certainly the case in Poland and Hungary, where the opposition is in total disarray. And rather than cooperating with each other, trying to set a cohesive critique of what these parties are doing in office, they're running in every which direction, and they're basically infighting amongst themselves. So even though in a PR system, it's probably not in the short term, electorally, right? You have to differentiate yourself. There would still be, you can do so nonetheless on the basis of a common set of commitments to democracy, and those have not been articulated. So I think that kind of coordination, that kind of sort of common commitment, this is what democratic language, this is what democratic politics looks like, is the next useful step. And then the policy differentiation. But I think without those first two, we're doomed to live in the age of populism. If someone's not willing to go high, we'll all sink low. Great. Thank you so much. Thank you.